History is epic. Watch it uncensored on Patreon. The bad habits of evil dictators. Dictators have risen and fallen throughout history, and we all know they're not the most pleasant of people. Best known for the atrocities they commit and the oppression of the people under them, they don't go down in history for the right reasons. But they are human beings just like the rest of us, and like the rest of us, they harbor some secrets. It's just that theirs are of the disgusting, repellent, and flat-out smelly variety. They were bad enough to be around anyway. But these bad habits make these dictators even more repulsive. Number 5. Hitler's uncontrollable farting. Adolf Hitler is one of the most famous dictators in history, responsible for the death of millions of people, the Holocaust, and of course sparking World War II. All in all, he wasn't a pleasant person. But what made him even worse to be around was his unbearably smelly posterior. Thanks to a combination of eating an excessive number of vegetables and poor advice from a doctor that many referred to as a quack, Adolf Hitler's rear was louder than the brass section of the New York Philharmonic. As Hitler got older and meaner, he also suffered from more and more medical issues. In fact, some historians now believe that he actually suffered from Parkinson's disease towards the end of his life. Others argue that most of his symptoms and problems were actually thanks to the excessive overmedication by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. As the Austrian dictator was a strict vegetarian, his diet reportedly consisted just of fresh vegetables, mashed potatoes, and pasta. Not items conducive to a happy stomach when eaten alone and in excess. As a result, from 1936 onward, Dr. Morell was fully in charge of Hitler's care and in fixing his delicate stomach. Unfortunately, the quack only made things worse, providing him with up to 28 pills per day. One of the worst of which was his use of Dr. Koster's anti-gas pills, which, thanks to its maximum dose of strychnine, actually made Hitler's cramps and farting more common. Not someone you'd want to share a bedchamber with. Poor Eva Braun. Number 4. Mao Zedong's rotten teeth. Mao Zedong, famously known as Chairman Mao, was, to put it mildly, not a nice man. During his rule of China from 1949 to 1976, Chairman Mao was responsible for up to an unbelievable 80 million deaths. From purification schemes to the killing of loyalists while under his communist rule, Mao seemingly had no reservations about torturing and murdering those he saw as a threat. Not someone you'd want to cross paths with, and even if you did, your stomach would immediately turn as soon as you spotted his awful, rotting teeth. That's because Mao strongly believed brushing your teeth wasn't necessary, as long as you rinsed them with tea. He was even quoted by his personal physician as saying, "I clean my teeth with tea. I never brush them. A tiger never brushes his teeth. Why are a tiger's teeth so sharp?" Needless to say, Mao's philosophy was very, very wrong. As a result of his complete lack of oral hygiene, his teeth looked like they were coated in green paint. A few were loose and pus oozed out of his gums. By the 1970s, his physician reported that all of Mao's teeth had blackened and the back had fallen out, and he was suffering from severe periodontal disease, as you can see in untouched photos from the time. All of which served to make him look like a PSA for why you definitely should brush your teeth. It's also worth mentioning that the apple clearly doesn't fall far from the tree. In 2011, Mao's grandson, Major General Mao Xinyu, was asked to recite a poem of his grandfather's live on air, during which he inexplicably picked his nose. It may be a bad habit shared by many, but most of us can manage to refrain from nose picking on live national television. Number 3. Stalin's crude drawings. Rounding off the 3 worst dictators of all time and their disgusting habits, we have Joseph Stalin. Responsible for upholding a regime that used mass murder as a form of control, including the genocide of the kulak class of Ukrainian farmers, Stalin had millions of citizens executed by his command. But when he wasn't busy murdering the population in order to bring them in line, Stalin had a rather interesting hobby, and by interesting, we mean akin to that of a teenage boy who was bored in class. As revealed for the first time at a Moscow gallery in 2009, Stalin's favorite pastime was to take male nude sketches by 19th century Russian painters and deface them. When doing so, his childish humor was immediately apparent, as per one sketch that depicted a naked man and a prostrate naked woman, Stalin had scribbled, "Idiot, you've completely forgotten what to do." In others, Stalin seemed to instead channel a latent philosopher, and not a very good one at that. For example, on a sketch of a naked man sitting in a thoughtful position, he scribbled, "One thinking fool is worse than 10 enemies." One unnamed handwriting expert confirmed these strange captions were definitely the work of Joseph Stalin, although why one of the most powerful and evil men in the world chose to spend his time scribbling weird captions on old drawings is anyone's guess. Number 2. Idi Amin and his oranges. While Ugandan dictator and megalomaniac Idi Amin demanded he was referred to as His Excellency President for Life Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin, VC DSO MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and the fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular, he was better known by another nickname, the Butcher of Uganda. During his rule, Idi Amin was responsible for the deaths of between 80 to 300,000 Ugandan civilians, ranging from regular citizens to high-ranking officials like the Anglican Archbishop. He also found the time to eat a lot of oranges. And by a lot, I mean up to 40 oranges per day. While we're all for eating healthily, like Hitler's excessive vegetable-based diet, Idi Amin may have gone a bit too far with his love of oranges, to the point that reportedly, by the end of his life, he referred to himself as a fruitarian, eating fruit almost exclusively. The reason for Idi Amin's love of oranges wasn't based purely on taste, however. He believed oranges to be nature's Viagra, and that by consuming so many, he was increasing his sexual prowess, making him better in the bedroom. No accounts exist to either confirm nor deny this, but his love of oranges was well known. So well known, he earned himself a nickname that sounds a bit nicer and more cutesy than the Butcher of Uganda, which was Dr. Jaffa, like Jaffa cake. It's also fair to assume that eating up to 40 oranges a day may have resulted in some ill effects. Given their acidity, nutritionists caution from eating them in huge quantities. It can result in stomach issues. Just 4 to 5 per day can cause heartburn, cramping, headaches, nausea, and upset stomach. If that's just 5, imagine what havoc 40 must have wreaked on the dictator's system. Still, it's doubtful anyone feels too sorry for him. Number 1. Ne Win's love of dolphin parts. General Ne Win was one of the worst things that could have happened to a newly independent Burma, now known as Myanmar. First appointed as prime minister, he seized power in a military coup. The army had complete control of the country and was totally exempt from the law, stealing, sexually assaulting, and killing those who opposed Ne Win. By the end of his rule, Burma had become one of the poorest countries in the world, and thousands had died in uprisings against Ne Win's regime. As well as his complete incompetence and brutality in running Burma, Ne Win also allegedly had a pretty gross habit. According to multiple sources, although only after his death, the dictator bathed in dolphin blood. As a deeply superstitious man who believed in things like juju surrounding the number 9, it's unsurprising that he also believed in myths surrounding the power of dolphin blood. Allegedly, dolphin blood has properties that keep you young, and Ne Win evidently believed this, as he would repeatedly and creepily washed in the stuff. Just don't ask where or how he got it. I don't think we'd want to know the answer. Life under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, famine, and S-21, 1975 to 1979. When the Vietnamese army captured Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge in 1979, they found the city in a terrible state, and among the horrors they came across was a former high school that had been turned into a prison and was known as Security Prison 21, or just S21. The dark buildings were enclosed in electrified barbed wire, and iron bars covered all the windows. The prisoners included academics, doctors, monks, students, and their teachers, as well as factory workers and engineers. All were accused of being enemies of the regime and tortured and forced to name their friends and family members as co-conspirators. Whole families were often brought in together to be interrogated and executed. Ultimately, paranoia meant that the regime began to turn on itself, and the cells were soon filled with party activists and their families, and even high-ranking politicians. At least 18,145 people had been imprisoned there, and all but a handful had been executed. S21 was only one of more than 150 torture and execution centers established by the Khmer Rouge. Today, it stands as a memorial to the lives lost and to the brutality that they inflicted upon the people of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was the name given to the members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the CPK, who ruled Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. They were led by the infamous Pol Pot, who attempted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. This led to one of the worst cases of genocide in history. Influenced by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, Pol Pot imagined his own super Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. After seizing power in a civil war in 1975, the CPK wanted to rapidly build the country under their own vision. Pol Pot compared the Cambodian revolution with those in China, Korea, and Vietnam, and proclaimed that no revolution would be as fast as his. Indeed, the CPK was obsessed with speed, and many in the party were paranoid that they would be replaced, and believed the faster their plans could be achieved, the safer they would be. The Super Great Leap was to be achieved independent of any foreign aid, through independent self-mastery. Khmer Rouge theorists believe that an initial period of self-imposed economic isolation would stimulate the rebirth of the crafts and the country's industrial capability. In order to follow this policy of extreme self-reliance, the CPK announced a 4-year plan to triple the country's rice production. However, Cambodia had suffered severely during the Civil War. Almost 3/4 of the draft animals needed to plow the fields had been killed, and by 1975, rice production had dropped by 84%. Such a rapid increase in production was impossible, but Pol Pot believed this was merely a matter of revolutionary willpower and instituted his policy of agricultural offenses, including a nationwide system of forced labor. He believed that achieving his economic goals would be as simple as winning the Civil War. The army and the CPK's agricultural warfare were the people, and manual labor was the key to victory. The purpose of every Cambodian was to work and advance the revolution. Villages were reorganized into cooperatives, and thousands of city dwellers were forced out of their homes to work on the farms. As a result of this policy, workers of all ages were forced to do 10 to 14 hours of hard labor per day in unsustainable conditions. Often, survivors reported working late into the night, particularly during harvest time, surrounded by encouraging slogans urging them to pledge to sacrifice your life to accomplish Angar's work, or to stay on the worksite until death. A lot of food was needed to feed all these productive farmers. However, rice was also needed for Pol Pot's economic goals, so large amounts of rice were extracted from the population for party use and export. The CPK provided nothing in return. Fareth, one survivor of the period, recalled that she was assigned to a children's work unit when she was 11 years old. Fareth was ordered to carry soil, dig trenches, and help build a local dam. She and her unit lived at the work site, sleeping under a rough shelter made out of palm leaves. The dam was considered a highly important project for the revolution, and her unit were given a comparatively extravagant food ration of 2 daily portions of rice and salt and sometimes fish soup. Still, Fareth was constantly hungry and exhausted, as even such plentiful rations were not sufficient to sustain such hard labor. When her unit had finished at the worksite 3 months later, the local officials held a celebration to commemorate the occasion. The celebration included a play, revolutionary songs, and a mass marriage ceremony. The young Fereth says she was personally praised for her hard work and felt so proud of herself. It was only later that Fereth learned about what happened to her two younger sisters during this time. Her grandmother had been placed in charge of them because she was too old to work. She was starving and grew too weak to look after the girls. Without someone to care for them, the little girls were so hungry that they became ill and died of starvation. Meanwhile, absolute socialism meant that all natural resources were the property of the state, and any signs of individualism or privatism were banned, including private gardens, private ownership of foodstuffs, and even the act of cooking privately, which was punishable by imprisonment and execution. The people were not even allowed to forage for food in the countryside. After Fereth's little sisters had died, her grandmother survived on a small amount of hidden medicine. However, the Khmer Rouge searched the village every 3 days, looking for so-called contraband, including cooking equipment and rice. The small stash of medicine was found and confiscated, along with the family's only cooking pot by local Khmer Rouge cadres. Fereth's grandmother refused to suffer this final indignity, and within a week she succumbed to a combination of illness and starvation and passed away. Although the situation rapidly deteriorated into a full-blown famine, Pol Pot continued to talk about agriculture as a military operation, and he saw enemies everywhere. In his mind, any shortfalls in production were the fault of saboteurs and ideological enemies. Anybody who criticized the CPK's policies was branded an enemy of the state and was arrested, tortured, and executed. While the farmers starved, the CPK continued to make thousands of arrests with those who it believed to be enemies or a threat to the state. Many experienced doctors were executed or hid their profession because any sign of a privileged or urban background, including education or professional training, were viewed with extreme suspicion by the Khmer Rouge and created a high risk of execution if discovered. Indeed, this led to a lack of medicine and healthcare at a time when many of the nation's workers were sickly and starving. Instead of seeking a solution, the Khmer Rouge mocked its victims. The suspicious CPK accused overworked and underfed workers of feigning illness to avoid work, saying those that were starving had caught an imaginary disease. CPK slogans said that we must wipe out all those who imagine they are ill and expel them from our society. There was no respite for the exhausted, starving, and sickly population, and many victims simply just gave up and collapsed and died. Utilizing its secret police, the Khmer Rouge rounded up, tortured, and executed anybody who was seen as an enemy. This also included all foreigners and ethnic minorities, those with connections to the previous Cambodian government, professionals and intellectuals, including anybody who had an education or understood a foreign language, and party members who had fallen foul of the regime. Innocent men, women, and children, even newborn babies, were brought to prisons like S-21 and coerced into confessing for imaginary crimes and providing the names of other alleged enemies of the state. For 12 days and nights, an engineer called Chumé was tortured at S-21. His tormentors whipped him with bamboo sticks and broke his fingers when he tried to shield himself. They shackled his legs and removed his toenails with pliers. Chumé was also subjected to electric shocks, which he feared the most. Electrodes were placed inside of his ears and the shocks deafened him. He said that he felt as though his eyes were on fire and he was ready to tell them everything they wanted to hear. The interrogators forced him to sign a false confession that he was working for the CIA and had recruited other men and women. The dozens of innocent acquaintances that he had named were also arrested, tortured, and murdered. Chumé had never heard of the CIA and never found out why he had been arrested. He was one of the few who actually survived their stay at S-21. Most foreigners had left the country before the end of the Civil War, but several were imprisoned at S-21, including the 26-year-old British teacher, John Dawson DeWorst. John was traveling the hippie trail to visit his friend in Malaysia when he met the owners of a small yacht, a Canadian, Stuart Glass, and a New Zealander, Kerry Hamill. They decided to sail north along the Thai coast toward Bangkok, when somehow the three men found themselves in Cambodian waters and their boat was seized by a revolutionary patrol boat. Stuart was shot dead immediately, while John and Kerry were taken to the infamous Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh. The men were undoubtedly tortured, and records show that John had written a confession that mixed the true events of his life with false accounts about his life as a CIA agent. After confessing, most inmates were brought to one of several sites known as the killing fields. In the 4 years of the CPK's rule, more than 1 million people were executed and buried in mass graves at these places. Khmer Rouge soldiers, young men or women usually taken from peasant families, would then execute their victims using brutal and horrific methods, such as poison or literally beating them to death. In some cases, they even made their victims dig their own graves first as a final insult. To this day, their remains are still being uncovered at the killing fields. Starvation and executions under the Khmer Rouge were responsible for around 1.5 to 2 million deaths, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population at that time. After the Vietnamese seized Phnom Penh in 1979, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge fled into Thailand to wage a guerrilla war. Support for the CPK gradually waned and the Khmer Rouge became less powerful and disbanded. Pol Pot died of a heart attack in 1998. In the final interview before his death, he said that his conscience was clear and everything he had done for his country. We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now, you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Con Thien, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank, all on Patreon. History is epic. Watch it uncensored. Idi Amin. Known as Big Daddy by his supporters and the Butcher by his critics, Idi Amin went from being a dirt poor boy from a town in northwest Uganda, so remote nobody knows its name, to becoming the third president of Uganda and a speaker on the global political stage. He was infamous for his ruthless stomping down of perceived traitors, expulsion of non-Africans, his widespread terror, and his taking joy in humiliation. Idi Amin's exact birth date is uncertain, with historians estimating anywhere between 1925 and 1928 as the true date. When Amin was born, his parents split, and it's believed he was largely raised by his mother, although he still saw his father infrequently. He grew up in the West Nile province among the Kakwa people, a small Islamic tribe who had settled in the region just a few decades prior. As a child and into his teen years, it's reported that he received little education due to limited opportunities for West Nile Ugandans, and by 21 he had few options on what to do next. Rather than attempt to cobble together more of an education, he joined the former British regiment, the King's African Rifles, and began the training that would come to define his future rule. Allegedly beginning his career as an assistant cook, he quickly rose through the ranks, taking promotion after promotion on his rise to the top. He was deployed to Somalia in 1949, helped put down the Shifta rebels, and was deployed again to snuff out the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. Along with being a skilled soldier, he was also quickly gaining a reputation for his cruelty. Amin showed so much unnecessary brutality during interrogations that it almost derailed his military career, but instead he was promoted to Effendi in 1959, the highest possible rank for a black African soldier in the British military. In addition to his military prowess at the KAR, Amin was also a skilled boxer, becoming a renowned Ugandan amateur boxing champion. His physical prowess and affinity for conflict spanned across his professional and personal life. Uganda was pushing towards independence as the 1950s came to a close, and Amin made a key alliance with Apollo Milton Obote, the leader of the Uganda People's Conference. Obote would go on to become the Prime Minister of Uganda when it reached independence in 1962. Amin was made a lieutenant in Obote's Ugandan army. His first order for Amin was to stop the cattle stealing in the north. Amin did this, but he also committed such atrocities that the British demanded he be tried for his crimes. Instead, Obote had him trained further in military tactics in the United Kingdom. When Amin got back to Uganda in 1964, the army was in full-scale mutiny, without anyone to hold control in his absence. Amin was tasked with getting it back in order. When he succeeded, he was promoted again, this time to deputy commander. He was then accused of smuggling gold, coffee, and ivory out of the Congo alongside Prime Minister Obote. Meanwhile, in 1966, Obote dismissed the government, declaring himself president. The allure of power drove Amin's ambitions higher and higher. He continued to hoard funds from smuggling and illicit arms dealing with Sudanese rebels, all the while fortifying his position in the Ugandan military. Bote promoted Amin to Chief of the Army and Air Force, a position that's forfeited even more power to Amin. After an unsuccessful assassination attempt on Bote's life in 1969, the president became more wary and tried to seize greater control of the military in 1970. All the while, Amin continued to build his network, working closely with Israeli and British agents in Uganda. Mistrusting of Amin, Bote attempted to demote him, but this too failed. While Bote was traveling to Singapore, Amin took advantage. In 1971, he staged a successful coup on the Ugandan government. While he called himself president, the title he preferred was, quote, His Excellency President for Life Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin, VC DSO MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa in general and Uganda in particular, end quote. Amin immediately got started with his atrocities. In his first few months, he brutally assassinated political threats and members of the Ugandan police before turning his attention on the public. Quickly, he disposed of the Chief of Justice, the Anglican Archbishop and the Vice-Chancellor of Mekari University, among other high-ranking officials. Within just 3 months, he also enlisted 10,000 new soldiers, almost half of which were ex-Anyanya guerrilla fighters, former Zairean freedom fighters, and those from Amin's home. In the first 6 months of his reign, Ugandans killed Ugandans with increasing alacrity, urged by Amin himself. From there, he then launched one of his first major attacks on humanity since taking over, the killing of approximately 3,000 Langi and Acholi soldiers, given their connection to the now exiled former Prime Minister Obote. He also created killer squads within what was called the State Research Bureau and Public Safety Unit to hunt down Obote's supporters and task them with snuffing out any opposition to his reign. Obote, from his exile in Tanzania, attempted to rally his followers to retake Uganda, but was unsuccessful. Tens of thousands of Asian residents were expelled from his country in 1972, which thoroughly wrecked the Ugandan economy to a point that its impact is still felt today. He publicly insulted the leaders of the free world, including the United States and Great Britain, and reversed Uganda's relations with Israel, instead buddying up with Colonel Muammar Mohammed al-Gaddafi of Libya, as well as the Soviet Union and the Palestinians. Despite this and public hostility from leaders in the US, UK, and Israel, they hypocritically worked with the dictator. In 1973, America actually took over Britain as Uganda's most prominent trading partner, despite publicly closing their embassy in Kampala that same year. Amin continued to act brutally and with abandon. In 1976, a group of Palestinians and members of the Badr Meinhof gang hijacked a French airliner at Entebbe Airport. With both Amin and the Ugandan army's support, the flight en route from Israel to France was held hostage by the two groups. However, Israeli forces launched an immediate counter-raid and freed the hostages. This sent Amin into a tirade. He executed several airport employees, a host of Kenyans that he blamed for the counter-raid, and an elderly British passenger who had been sent to a hospital after the attempted hijacking. By this point, Amin received his nickname, the Butcher of Uganda, and he lived up to that moniker. He had killed over 300,000 civilians, including some high-ranking Uganda citizens such as the Anglican Archbishop, the Governor of the Bank of Uganda, and the Chancellor of Mekari College. Yet he grew more paranoid over time, and it was clear that his grip was slipping. When a collection of Ugandans fled over the border to Tanzania, he flew into a rage and accused Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere of attempting to foment insurrection in Uganda. In typical Amin fashion, he immediately turned to military action in an attempt to enact his revenge. He sent a mixture of Ugandan military and Libyan support into Tanzania, aiming to punish Nyerere as well as those that had deserted. His goal was to take Kagera Salient, a small territory north of the Kagera River. While he initially took the strip of land, it didn't last long. Just 2 weeks later, Nyerere launched a counterattack with the help of Ugandan rebels. The momentum quickly went against Amin as the rebels and Tanzanians took Kampala. Amin's military was driven back to the capital, and when it became clear he wasn't going to win, Amin fled the country, leaving the Ugandan rebels to put Yusufu Lule into the role of president, effectively ending Amin's bloody reign of terror. Amin's retreat took him to Libya, where he stayed for a decade under the care of al-Gaddafi before he moved on to Saudi Arabia. There he lived out the rest of his days until he died in 2003, never held accountable for the crimes he committed. Haiti's murderous voodoo president, Papa Doc Duvalier. Francois Papa Doc Duvalier was one of the worst dictators both his country and the world have ever seen. During his regime, which lasted from 1957 to 1971, the nation of Haiti saw its population beaten, tortured, murdered, and starved in order to subjugate the people to Duvalier's will. Relying on an aura of mysticisms and voodooism, the dictator would claim his primary intention was to destabilize the mixed-race elite in order to promote the prosperity of the poor black majority population they dominated. In order to achieve his goals, he committed many atrocities that the rest of the world, sadly, turned a blind eye to for far too long. But who actually was Papa Doc Duvalier? Born April 14, 1907 to humble beginnings, his life would take Duvalier from the halls of medical school to the pulpits of political authority. Although politically active from a young age, Papa Doc Duvalier actually first trained to be a physician, looking to help eradicate the awful disease yaws that was an epidemic among Haiti's black majority population. During his medical career, he spent some time working in the U.S. Army, helping to reduce the number of yaws victims. But at the same time, Duvalier never forgot his desire to change Haiti. He wrote journals on black nationalism and the rise of the common black majority against the Europeanized elite. This and his work helping to treat yaws endeared him to the black population and earned him the nickname Papa Doc. Perhaps seeing its advantages, he relied heavily on the nickname politically, using it to advance stories of his voodoo roots and later claims of mysticism. Meanwhile, Haiti's government was becoming more and more unstable until a 1950 coup replaced the sitting president, Umar, who was sympathetic to the black population, with a much less sympathetic Colonel Paul Magloire. Duvalier clearly saw the opportunity many others did, taking the time to build his political allegiance and mystic image. By 1956, Magloire was deposed, and within the next 6 months, 5 provisional governments rose and fell, and Duvalier campaigned hard to become the next leader of Haiti. By the end of the 1957 campaign, he swept the elections with 679,000 votes to just 266,000 and 9,000 respectively for his political rivals. Sadly, this was nothing short of disastrous for Haiti's future, as within months, Papa Doc's true nature became evident. Almost immediately after gaining power, Papa Doc set to oppressing his opposition by arresting over 100 political figures in the first month alone. Businesses that closed in Port-au-Prince in protest of Duvalier's ascension were looted, and soon anti-Duvalier publications and newspapers found their offices destroyed. Cleverly, Papa Doc also crafted a climate of uncertainty and instability among leaders on his own side. He continuously deposed and replaced his top military leaders in order to prevent any organized resistance or coup rhetoric, and created his own Garde Présidentielle, whose loyalty were to him, not the country of Haiti. Not unlike Hitler's Gestapo, these secret police, better known as the Tonton Macoutes, were harbingers of oppression, torture, and murder. The Tonton Macoutes was made up of the black majority population and worked to help cultivate Papa Doc's voodooist image. Their name was based on Haiti's traditional boogeyman, and they always appeared wearing dark glasses, dark clothes, and carrying bulging holsters. Altogether, they gave off a mysterious, sinister, and supernatural vibe, which played perfectly into Duvalier's own. Papa Doc would deliberately dress as the guardian of graveyards, known as Baron Samedi, a spirit that was directly linked to voodooism, something which in turn appealed to the voodoo faithful among the population. The reality of the Tonton, however, was even darker than the story of the boogeyman. Estimated to have had 25,000 members by 1959, they not only gunned down Duvalier's political rivals, but burnt people alive, executed many without trial, and even desecrated the bodies of the dead with opponents' heads set on ice and sent to the royal palace to display as a reminder of Papa Doc's hold on Haiti. They were indiscriminately violent, often sexually assaulted women without consequence, and frequently extorted and blackmailed Haitians. On other occasions, they'd even randomly string up bodies in marketplaces to show the complete freedom from law that Tonton enjoyed. Any opposition was small and quickly quashed. One of the most notable of these was a 1958 coup attempt that saw former officers, several U.S. mercenaries, and 3 ex-deputy sheriffs from the U.S. land in Haiti in an attempt to free the country from Duvalier's grip. Unfortunately, once the size of their small troop was discovered, they were mercilessly killed by Duvalier's men. A year later, Duvalier suffered a heart attack that left him incapacitated for 4 months. During this time, Barbeau, head of the Tontons, took over day-to-day running of Haiti, putting down an invasion of Cuban and exiled Haitian guerrillas and negotiating with the U.S. Unfortunately for Barbeau, in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. Upon recovering, Duvalier became increasingly suspicious of Barbeau's motives, concluding he was seeking to usurp his authority. As the leader of the all-powerful Tontons, Papa Doc recognized Barbeau's power and influence and suppressed it by calling him a traitor and imprisoning him for 18 months in the infamous Fort Dimanche, a place where some of the most notorious Tonton crimes, torture, and murders took place during Duvalier's reign. It was also in Fort Dimanche that Duvalier reportedly took pleasure in seeing atrocious acts carried out for himself. According to several accounts, Papa Doc put peepholes in torture chambers and participated in plunging men and women into baths of sulfuric acid, involving himself personally in some of the very worst forms of torture that occurred during his reign. After his release, Barbeau was thoroughly done with Duvalier's antics and actually did then launch a counter-assault on the president. In response, Duvalier spread rumors that Barbeau could appear as a great big black dog, tragically leading to their culling across Haiti. Eventually, the Tontons and military cornered Barbeau and his conspirators, putting an end to the revolt by executing them where they stood. Like any president, Papa Doc had to deal with re-election, but as per his tyrannical regime, rigged it in his favor. In 1961, he was unanimously re-elected in a campaign where he won 1.3 million votes to 0. By now, the true depths of Duvalier's delusional self-perception were fully apparent. It was in 1961 that he also ordered the construction of what he called Duvalierville, which was essentially an entire village intended to stand as a testament to his regime, to be built through forced donations by government officials. The project, however, was never completed. Over the next few years, invasions and coups continued, each one successfully put down by Duvalier and the Tontons, using his militia to massacre hundreds of families and brutally destroy communities in their rampage of terror. By 1964, Papa Doc sought to consolidate his power once and for all. After another corrupt referendum, in which there were only spaces to choose yes on the ballot, Duvalier named himself Haiti's President of Life, effectively ending the democratic farce the country still labored under. Among one of his more bizarre propagandist choices was a complete rewrite of the Lord's Prayer to be about himself, forcing schoolchildren to recite the new version. Our Doc, who art in the National Palace for life, hallowed be thy name in the present and future generations. Thy will be done at Port-au-Prince and in the provinces. Give us this day our new Haiti. You get the point. In similar fashion, Papa Doc would also claim himself to be comparable to Dessalines, de Gaulle, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and even Christ himself. He gave himself new titles such as the Apostle of National Unity and worthy heir to the founders of the Haitian nation, and the National Palace was lit up with his message, I am the Haitian flag, one and indivisible. But despite his tyranny and even some popularity among the black majority, Duvalier's reign was not to last much longer. Suffering from ill health, on April 21, 1971, Duvalier passed away, and his son, nicknamed Baby Doc, took up his mantle. Although it's unclear precisely how many Haitians suffered under Duvalier's cruelty, which was continued with his son, estimated numbers for those killed stand between 30 to 60,000. He will forever be remembered as the voodoo dictator that scarred both the Haitian population and any prosperity it had started to nurture.
Operation Pastorius, the failed Nazi spy ring in America. The plan for the Nazi spy ring, Operation Pastorius, was in itself fairly simple. 8 men divided into 2 teams of 4 were to land along America's coast and coordinate a series of sabotage operations using incendiary devices. The main end goal was to destroy the Pennsylvania Railroad Station in Newark, New Jersey, the Hellgate Bridge in New York, and locks in St. Louis and Cincinnati. But thanks to one of the spies, the whole plan was scuppered before it ever really began. Operation Pastorius was another of Hitler's attempts to build a spy network that could infiltrate America from the inside. A dramatic earlier attempt met its downfall the previous summer in 1941, after all of its principal agents were arrested by the FBI. Operation Pastorius began a year later in the summer of 1942 after Pearl Harbor. But it had even less success than its predecessor, resulting in the end of Hitler's subversive designs in America. The 8 men who made up the spies were all German-born men who had spent a large period in America. George John Dowse, Ernest Berger, Edward John Curling, Herbert Haupt, Richard Quirin, Heinrich Harm Heinck, Hermann Otto Neubauer, and Werner Thiel spent 2 months in spy school on a farm before the mission began in May 1942. Lieutenant Walter Kappa, a Nazi intelligence officer who chose the men based on their English ability, devotion to Nazism, and their perceived desire to be saboteurs, ran the operation. The leader of the first team, Edward John Curling, had joined the Nazi Party early in 1928 before moving to America and remaining there until the war. He was to take a U-boat and land along the Floridian coastline. The second team was led by George John Dowse and consisted of Ernest Berger, Quirin, and Heinck. Each boat was well stocked with forged paperwork, supplies, explosives, wires, fuses, and plenty of US dollars to get the spies through the states to their meeting place in Cincinnati. Landing on a quiet stretch of beach at Amagansett, Long Island on June 13, 1942, the 4 men dressed in civilian clothing did not expect to be almost immediately confronted by a young U.S. Coast Guard named John Cullen. Dowse and the others had already received orders to kill anyone who could impact or derail their plan, but instead Dowse engaged the young man in conversation, claiming they were fishermen. But Dowse's assurances didn't fool Cullen, and despite his excellent English, he asked to see the men's paperwork. Instead, Dowse gave him the equivalent of a couple months of groceries as hush money and warned him that if he ever wanted to see his family again, he would keep quiet. Cullen, realizing his choices were acceptance or death, took the money and promised his silence. Of course, this lasted about 5 minutes. When he returned to his station, Cullen promptly informed his superiors of the strange and suspicious men he had encountered. Dowse himself was already starting to turn. He later claimed he had always intended to turn himself over to the FBI, but whether that was entirely true or due to the meeting with Cullen was impossible to say. Either way, Dowse sussed long before anyone else that the jig was up. The team split into 2 pairs to rendezvous in New York City later, and Dowse soon approached the one man he thought might be on his side, Ernest Berger. Despite being chosen for the mission, 36-year-old Berger had actually spent some time in Nazi concentration camps after criticizing the occupation of Poland. He was offered a role in Operation Pastorius and took it as a way to escape his imprisonment. All in all, he seemed an interesting choice for a mission that depended on absolute loyalty to the Nazis. Dowse, knowing this, waited until the 2 were alone to approach Berger. It was there he revealed his plans to betray the spy ring. Sure that Cullen had already exposed them, Dowse told Berger he planned to go to the FBI and speak directly with Director J. Edgar Hoover and tell them everything involved in Operation Pastorius. Berger immediately agreed. Just 30 hours after their initial landing, Dowse called the FBI office in New York, calling himself Frank Daniel Pastorius of Germany and announcing he had some important information for J. Edgar Hoover himself. Although he wasn't able to meet or speak to Hoover, an earlier report from John Cullen to the FBI confirmed Dowse's identity. He met with federal agents in Washington where he showed them the vast amounts of money he'd been given for the plot and gave them the information of the other group led by Curling, who at that point had yet to land in Florida. Later, Hoover took credit for the whole expose, making it sound like efficient work by the FBI who had uncovered the plot, rather than learning of the spy ring thanks to the betrayal of George Dowse. Either way, however, thanks to Dowse, Curling, Haupt, Neubauer, and Thiel were condemned before they ever even set foot on American soil. 4 days after Dowse's party had landed, the other half of the Nazi spy ring landed 4 miles south of Ponte Vedra near Jacksonville. They quickly brought their large waterproof crates containing their explosives onto the shore and buried them in the sand. Taking the money, they headed to downtown Jacksonville. As they traveled up to New York, the men were brazen in flaunting themselves and their secret operation. The youngest in the group, 22-year-old Herbert Haupt, met with both a former girlfriend and another friend, rather foolishly, as both of them later turned him in to the FBI. He connected with family who gave him aid on his journey, and at one point Haupt even waltzed himself into the FBI offices in Chicago to ask if he was under any suspicion. The officers there, aware of the covert plan to follow and arrest the remaining 4 members of Operation Pastorius, lied, assuring him of his safety. Gradually, all 4 men were arrested by the FBI. On June 24th, Curling, as the leader, was taken back to Jacksonville by federal agents, who instructed him to reveal the burial locations of the explosives, which he soon did. They charged all 8 men with violating the 81st and 82nd Articles of War, and the sections of the laws of war relating to espionage, sabotage, and conspiracy. The amount of money carried by the men was enough to convince the FBI that this was Hitler's big plan for the States, and one the Nazis were sure of the success of. After their arrest, things moved quickly and with President Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal involvement. On July 1, 1942, it was announced that the trial would take place in a military court rather than a civil one, and 7 U.S. generals would try the defendants. The choice was deliberate by Roosevelt, who expected the men to receive the death penalty. The trial of the Operation Pastorius spy ring caused some controversy, however. The chosen high-ranking generals had no formal legal training, and 7 of the 8 spies were given the same 2 lawyers to work on their defense. Something that doesn't usually occur due to potential conflicts. Hitler was reportedly furious. As a result, the case was actually referred to the Supreme Court while it was ongoing. 2 days before it ended, the court ruled in the military court's favor, sealing the men's fate. On July 8th, the trial began, in secretive circumstances. Windows were covered and reporters banned, with routes to the courtroom changed every day of the 3 weeks it lasted. Haupt claimed he went along with the plan in fear. Thiel claimed he thought it was just about spreading propaganda and had longed to return to the States. Neubauer said it was a soldier's duty to carry out orders and not to think, and therefore shouldn't be held responsible. Curling, one of Hitler's earliest followers and arguably the staunchest Nazi of all, said nothing. Things were not quite so dire for Dowse and Berger as the other 6 men. Dowse received separate legal counsel, and the U.S. court acknowledged their role in bringing the spy ring to light. By August 3rd, the trial was over, and the sentence for all 8 men had been decided: death by electrocution. The sentences were carried out promptly, with Haupt being first to face the electric chair. But Dowse and Berger got a reprieve. Rather than death, Dowse was sentenced to 30 years in a federal prison. Berger's sentence was life. Each served just 6 years of their prison sentence before President Truman commuted their sentences and deported them to Germany in 1948. Berger later died in anonymity, but Dowse's stench of betrayal followed him throughout the rest of his life until his death in 1991. The great Nazi spy ring had ended, not with a bang, but a whimper. Throwing people from helicopters, Pinochet's reign of terror over Chile. Augusto Pinochet became president of Chile on the 11th of September 1973, when, with the support of the U.S. government, he successfully overthrew the country's democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. What followed was nearly a 17-year-long attack on Chilean human rights, democracy, and way of life that still reverberates in the country to this day. It is not known where all his victims' bodies are buried, both metaphorically and literally, as the true depths of Pinochet's political regime of terror only began to be revealed after several enlightening reports were published in the early 2000s. Who was Augusto Pinochet? Before his rise to power, Augusto Pinochet was a career soldier, born on the 25th of November 1915 in the port city of Valparaiso. He worked his way through the ranks to become the youngest student of 1948 to enter the Academy of War at just 32 years old. From there, his career took him from Chile to Ecuador and back again, as he spent the next few decades rising to the rank of Major General and even escorting Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro during his trip to Chile in 1971. By January of the next year, he had become the Army's commander-in-chief, leaving him perfectly positioned for what was to come next: the coup. In the last 2 decades, declassified files have revealed the extent of the CIA's involvement in the Chilean coup, including nurturing the country's political climate to a place where a coup would be accepted, destabilization of President Allende's rule, and on-the-ground support in the case of potential failure. With an already weakened government and almost complete loss of control of the armed forces, one of the prime catalyst moments for the coup was when the commander-in-chief of the army, Carlos Prats, resigned and was replaced with someone Allende thought he could trust: General Augusto Pinochet. On September 11, 1973, the armed forces were ordered to surround major cities and areas with the potential for resistance and cutting off communications with a clear message: they would not be afraid to kill those who defied them. Allende, despite knowing the likely outcome of the situation, refused to flee. He died in the presidential palace, and although official records claim his death was suicide using a rifle gifted to him by Castro, plenty of other evidence points to his murder by Pinochet's henchmen. Despite minimal opposition, the days following the coup were so bloodthirsty, it's unknown how many people actually died, as estimates varied from 2,000 to 10,000 casualties. One thing, however, was clear: the coup wasn't targeted just at political leaders, but anyone Pinochet and the armed forces saw as a potential threat, and even those that they didn't. Working-class people experienced bombings, roundups by the armed forces, and large-scale raids and imprisonments. Political prisoners suffered torture and brutality before their eventual murder. Some of the more shocking reports detail instances of severe beatings, psychological torture, hanging prisoners by their arms for long periods, suffocation, severe degradation, and assault, among many other horrific atrocities. After the coup was over, the new leader, Pinochet, told the press that he was only elected as the first military head due to his age, and that each armed forces chief would have their turn. The reality was that he would do anything to stop that from happening, including the murder and torture of anyone who opposed him. Pinochet's reign of terror really grew in intensity less than a month later: the Caravan of Death. On October 15, 1973, he sanctioned a series of targeted, brutal attacks that left a trail of death in their wake. He looked to General Sergio Arellano Stark, another coup leader, to spearhead the so-called Caravan of Death, claiming he was simply streamlining the justice system for political prisoners and regional representatives of the old Allende government. In other words, anyone from police chiefs to trade unionists and civic leaders were targeted and found themselves suddenly acquainted with Pinochet's newly formed death squads and marked as political dissidents. The Caravan of Death traveled via Puma helicopter to the major Chilean cities of La Serena, Copiapó, Antofagasta, and Calama, leaving a trail of 68 deaths in their wake in just over 4 days. Most of its victims were political opponents that had actually turned themselves in to the new Chilean government, only to be immediately beaten and interrogated once incarcerated. Most bodies were later found in common graves. However, 14 were never recovered, and it's possible they became some of the first to be thrown from the helicopters into the ocean, as it was later reported occurred during Pinochet's regime. These mass executions were a statement by Pinochet on how he intended to run Chile and attack non-violent opposition and even civilian supporters of the old government. After the caravan's initial run, General Stark and other members of the death squad formed Pinochet's new Chilean secret police agency, the DINA, or National Intelligence Directorate, on June 14, 1974. Not unlike Nazi Germany's Gestapo, the members of the DINA would commit atrocities under the banner of the new law, continuing to kill and repress any potential opposition. By the end of the year, it was estimated there were over 700 agents of the DINA operating across Chile. Those detained would be shipped to prison and concentration camps, where conditions were appalling enough without the horrendous acts of prolonged torture that these victims had to endure. Pinochet's arrest. Despite his brutal tactics for remaining in power, Pinochet lost a 1988 mandated election, eventually retiring the presidency in 1990. When he stepped down, he became a senator for life. But despite all his attempts to remain untouchable, he was finally arrested in the UK in 1998 at the age of 83. In an unprecedented move against the still powerful Pinochet, Spanish authorities pushed for his extradition, and subsequently countries like the United States were pressured to release classified documents about their involvement in his regime. Among the atrocities discovered was the fate of Chilean nationals who had disappeared during Pinochet's tenure, revealing information on some of the infamous death flights that occurred across Chile and other Latin American countries in the 70s and 80s. Death flights and the Rettig Report. In 1991, the Rettig Report was released, an in-depth inquiry into the human rights abuses that occurred under Pinochet's dictatorship. In it, multiple victims of Chile's death flights are identified. These flights largely took place in Puma helicopters and were responsible for rounding up anyone they saw opposing Pinochet, ultimately drugging them and throwing them into the ocean. Tragically, this meant many people never learned the fate of their loved ones, nor were able to seek closure through the return of the bodies. Across the Rettig Report, multiple specific incidents of death flights or the use of helicopters in the removal of citizens were mentioned, the first of which was on September 25, 1973, just 14 days after Pinochet seized power. Ricardo Bustos Martinez, a 21-year-old civilian with no political ties, was arrested, beaten, and put into a helicopter. He was never seen again. Later, on October 11th of the same year, a teacher and member of the Radical Party named Luis Barrientos was arrested and put onto a helicopter. His body was found at the mouth of the Imperial River, making it extremely likely that he was actually murdered on the helicopter and then just thrown out of it. Other reports within the document reveal similar horrendous acts of violence. A former communist official, Humberto Rodriguez, was literally gutted with a knife before being thrown into the ocean. In another instance, another Communist Party leader, along with other drugged prisoners, was thrown into the ocean after being sliced open sometime around October 20th. In 2001, more of Pinochet's crimes came to light. Under the new Chilean president, Ricardo Lagos, further investigations uncovered the fate of 120 missing detainees who were tossed from helicopters during his regime. In the same year, retired Colonel Oglenier Benavente also revealed the part that Pinochet's personal pilot, Brigadier Antonio Palomo Contreras, played in the death flights, claiming that he frequently made bodies disappear using his helicopter, saying, "Some were dropped into the ocean, others were thrown on the high peaks of the Andes." But despite Pinochet's arrest, he never truly faced any consequences for his numerous crimes against humanity. He was returned to Chile on medical grounds in 2000, and the Chilean Supreme Court dropped prosecution charges against him in 2002. He resigned his seat as senator for life that same year, aged 87. And passed away on the 10th of December 2006. Having lived the long life he had denied so many others.
When a YouTube prank killed Kim Jong-un's brother. The target, a bald, fat, 45-year-old Korean man, was making his way through an international airport on his way home to the Chinese territory of Macau. As he threaded his way through the crowds in broad daylight, he was approached from behind by a prankster called Duan, who grabbed him and smeared an oil over his eyes, and a second prankster called Siti, who approached from the front and did the same. Neither woman had any idea that this old Korean man was the half-brother of the current dictator of North Korea. The prankster, Siti Aisha, was born in poverty in Indonesia, her parents not even able to afford her high school. She instead sought employment in the city, then overseas at Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Likewise, Vietnamese national Duan Thi Huong was a waitress who tried her hand at modeling, and had been appearing on online prank channels for a year with limited success. Both women would be approached by a man claiming to be the producer of a Japanese show and was willing to pay the women the equivalent of $100 for each prank they participated in. Eager to make such a large amount of money, they agreed. They engaged in numerous pranks in public spaces, such as grabbing a stranger's hand and seeing how they reacted, telling men to close their eyes and spraying them with water, or sneaking up behind a victim and smearing baby oil on their face before running off. In February 2017, the women were in Kuala Lumpur Airport in Malaysia, where a producer of the channel pointed out the victim of the next prank. After the attack, the Korean man approached airport security and told them what had happened and that he was feeling dizzy. He was brought to the airport medical facility where his condition rapidly worsened as he started to have a seizure. He would be rushed to the hospital, but would die before the ambulance would arrive. The man was Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Nam was born in 1971, the eldest son and heir apparent of Kim Jong-il. He would have a falling out with his father and would live in exile from North Korea, taking up residence in the Chinese enclave of Macau, where he was known to have lived a playboy lifestyle, enjoying the luxuries of life, including a fondness for expensive watches, wine, and gambling in what he dubbed as the Las Vegas of Asia. The reason for the falling out with his father remains unclear. One potential reason occurred in 2001 when Nam, accompanied by 2 women and his 4-year-old son, snuck into Japan in order to visit Tokyo Disneyland. He was using a forged passport from the Dominican Republic, which claimed he was a Chinese national. After being detained at the Narita International Airport, he was deported to Beijing without actually setting foot in the happiest place on earth. This event was a great embarrassment for Kim Jong-il, who canceled his state visit to China over the incident. Another reason for his loss of favor with the North Korean dictator was his more liberal approach to governance. According to Nam, after his education in Switzerland, he came to realize that his home nation was in desperate need of reforms, and even suggested that the authoritarian economic model be opened up to a more free market approach. His father forced him to leave the country, fearing that his son was, quote, turning into a capitalist, end quote. In his years in exile, there was also a possibility that Nam was an informant for the CIA and other foreign intelligence agencies. North Korea is one of, if not the most closed off and secretive nations on the planet, and a wealth of information about the nation and ruling regime that Nam could provide was too tempting of an opportunity to pass up. Nam allegedly made contact with a CIA agent only days before the assassination, though for obvious reasons this is impossible to confirm with any certainty. Adding to suspicions of international spying was the presence of $120,000 in cash he had on hand at the time of his assassination. Nam also had good relations with the Chinese government and was seen as a potential replacement for his half-brother and current North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, should that regime collapse. Regardless of the reason, he was seen as a liability by his half-brother and needed to be eliminated. After the prank, both the women went to separate restrooms to wash their hands. When they emerged, the producers of the reality show were nowhere to be seen. Over the next 2 years, both Siti Aisha and Duan Thi Huang were imprisoned, put on trial for murder to which they pleaded not guilty. They admitted to participating in the prank, but denied any knowledge that what they were doing would be fatal to Nam. An investigation was conducted to determine the exact cause of death. It was determined that each woman smeared baby oil on Nam's face, each one laced with a separate chemical. Once combined, these 2 substances created the potent toxin VX, a nerve agent classified by the UN as a weapon of mass destruction. It's far harder for VX to enter through the palms than the eyes, which may explain why both women survived, with only one falling temporarily ill. Incidentally, Nam must have had some clue about his potential assassination and its means, since at the time of his death his traveling bag contained 12 doses of atropine, a drug that's used as an antidote against chemical nerve agents and insecticide poisoning, though it is unknown as to why he did not take the antidote. Further investigation revealed that 4 men, later identified as North Korean nationals, had witnessed the incident before boarding flights to leave the country. Another North Korean national, Ri Jong-chol, was arrested on suspicions of his involvement in the assassination, though he would later be released. The event was also the source of major diplomatic tensions between Malaysia and North Korea. The Malaysian government demanded that the 4 men be turned over for questioning. The Koreans refused and detained all Malaysians from leaving North Korea, essentially as hostages. An additional diplomatic hurdle was Kim Jong-nam's body, which was being held for investigation by Malaysian law enforcement. As far as North Korea was concerned, the man was Kim Chol, the fake name on Nam's passport, and as a North Korean national should be returned immediately, which Malaysian authorities refused before the true identity was discovered. Suspiciously, a week after the assassination, there was an attempted break-in of the mortuary holding Nam. The political standoff led to the severing of diplomatic ties between the two nations. This is especially ironic since the relationship between Malaysia and North Korea up to this point was strong, with Malaysia being the first nation whose citizens were able to travel to the DPRK without a visa. As for the 2 women, they were both accused of murder and forced to stand trial, with the death penalty looming over their heads. Their lawyers asserted that they were unwitting pawns in the North Korean plot and were completely innocent of the charges leveled against them. They argued that in the hours leading up to the prank, Siti and Duan did not act like they were about to kill someone, nor afterwards, as they didn't try to clean their clothes, something you would do if you knowingly handled a deadly nerve agent, nor did they attempt to go into hiding. After 2 years of investigations, testimonies, and examinations, in March of 2019 the prosecution dropped all charges against Siti Aisha, though they made it clear that this was not an acquittal and that she could be recharged in the future, though this has not happened. The decision was the result of diplomatic pressure from the Indonesian government, as well as a lack of concrete evidence against Aisha. On April 1, 2019, Duan Thi Huang was offered a plea deal in which she would plead guilty to the lesser charge of causing hurt with a dangerous weapon, which carries a penalty of up to 10 years imprisonment. She accepted the offer rather than risk the mandatory death penalty for murder. After pleading guilty to this reduced charge, she was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in prison, though due to her good behavior and cooperation with the authorities, she was released after only a month. In the long and complex history of espionage and assassinations, the murder of Kim Jong-nam will no doubt be remembered as worthy of any spy novel, and just goes to show that even the seemingly most innocent of pranks can easily have unintended consequences.